And we're on.
Cool. Hello, and welcome to the Glasgow University History Society podcast. Today we are joined by the Politics Society for our discussion on Guy Fawkes and the Gunpowder Treason plot, as well as our use of Fawkes as a figure against state oppression in the world today. Here to discuss this topic with me, there is
Robbie Patterson.
Brendan O'Keefe, Pulsoc President.
And I'm Ben Keenan, I'm Vice President of the Politics Society.
And there's me, John Hill. So first I'll give some context to the period we're looking at. So prior to the 1530s, England had been a Catholic state like the rest of Western Europe. In the reign of Henry VIII, we begin to see religious transformation into a Protestant state, with events such as the dissolution of the monasteries. And later we see some consolidation of this change in the short reign of Edward V. A Catholic resurgence in the reign of Queen Mary is evidenced by Fox's Book of Martyrs, and then increasingly harsher restrictions on recusant Catholics and the loss of their civil rights in the reign of Elizabeth I in the context of the Anglo-Spanish War in 1587. Catholics in England are therefore in a desperate situation in 1600. However, they see the great Catholic power of Spain as potential salvation from oppression. These hopes are dashed when King James VI of Scotland succeeds Elizabeth on the English throne. Styling himself as Rex Pacificus, he wants to be known as a peacemaker, and in 1604 he ends the war with Spain. With the hope of foreign salvation gone, some extreme elements within England's Catholic population plan more direct action against the regime. Firstly, Guy Fawkes is an Englishman who had been baptized as a Protestant, but his years of service in the Spanish army had convinced him of the righteousness of the Catholic cause. It also gave him skills and munitions, which was quite invaluable to the plotters at the time. The Gunpowder Plot itself was organised by Sir Robert Catesby, an English nobleman whose family were recusant Catholics, those who had actually refused to accept the new church. Catesby planned to destroy the Houses of Parliament and in doing so kill the king, all the members of the government as well as the kingdom's aristocracy. After this was done, the plotters would stage a rising in the English Midlands and seize power in a coup. In doing this, Fawkes had the critical but relatively minor role of planting and detonating the explosives. The plot unravelled when Parliament was delayed several months until November the 5th, 1605, meaning that the gunpowder stored under the Commons was actually spoiled. In trying to quickly find replacement powder, the plotters involved too many people in the conspiracy, and this allowed the authorities to track them down and spoil the plan. So Fawkes was arrested and the gunpowder plot removed. Despite the failure of the crucial part of the plan, Catesby and other plotters still made a chaotic attempt at the rising, ending in Catesby's death on November the 8th, and others followed by the end of November the 12th. Fawkes was tortured and finally executed on January 31st, 1606. The events of his execution, having been hanged, drawn and quartered, meant that his name became far more associated with the Gunpowder Plot than Catesby, even though his role was actually minor compared to his. Every November the 5th, Protestants across the British Isles have celebrated a delivery from tyranny. Fawkes' effigy is commonly burnt on bonfire night. So the first question I'll put to us, the four of us, is that, to start with, how far would we say that James I of England's reign was oppressive, bearing in mind his attempt to become what was called Rex Pacificus?
I guess it was quite oppressive. I don't know so much about in terms of what he did before the plot, but obviously after it, he took away the vote from Catholics and stuff, and it was just very they lost a lot of their rights. So he clearly don't know if he had an agenda, but then it was very oppressive towards the Catholic population.
He definitely was, and I think that can in part be attributed to his upbringing. So James I and the main thing about him is he was raised by a radical Protestant minister. So right off the bat, he's been full-blown indoctrinated by some very hardline Protestantism. And you can see that in a lot of the texts he wrote himself. So for example, he wrote things like Daemonology, and stuff like the North Berwick witch trials happened under his watch and with his direct consent. He was a radical Protestant, and tried to enforce that throughout the entire kingdom as much as he could, which did mean, for example, resurrecting witch hunts. And curiously enough, even though he was a radical Protestant, with regards to the political establishment, he was a big fan of bishops. So I'm fairly certain, as far as I remember, in Scotland, he had reinstated bishops to the Scottish Parliament and made sure they had a prominent voice and they were directly under the purview of the monarch. So he essentially created a large voter bloc for him and his mates. So he's already quite an authoritarian guy who's used to getting his way, starting off in Scotland. And the minute he comes down to England, that's when he gets that major pushback from the parliamentarians.
Yeah, I mean, I find his reign absolutely fascinating purely for the reason that I'm speaking from a Catholic perspective. My mother's side are English and also Catholics, so we have a bit of a stake in the history of this. My whole thing about this is if the Gunpowder Plot had succeeded, it wouldn't have been good for Catholics in the slightest. Even if they had somehow managed to kill the king and a majority of Parliament, there is no absolute way that the remnants of what remained of the state at the time were going to allow a restoration to Catholicism. I mean, it would have just become a Protestant absolute monarchy. And I mean, obviously persecution against Catholics in the centuries following the Gunpowder Plot weren't exactly good. If you're talking about something being a false flag attack among English Catholics, then you know that people were kind of a little bit like, hang on, was this entire thing orchestrated just so they can oppress us even more? So I find the reign absolutely fascinating. I find the upbringing definitely had a big bearing on how he acted in regards to recusant Catholics, Catholics in general, and just what I guess was perceived as kind of outside influence on his kingdom.
Yeah, it certainly seems that the Stuart idea of divine right of kings sort of played a part as well. It seems that he actually wrote a book about how kingship should work, and obviously that was intended for his son Charles I, which ironically did not turn out very well. So, yeah, I think that does sort of give us an insight into the sort of regime that we're dealing with here with James I's reign, that it has a sense of oppression modelled on the sort of French Catholic absolutism that we see just across the Channel. And obviously with their dealings with the Huguenots French, if you don't know who the Huguenots were, they were the French Protestants that Elizabeth I actually helped financially support in the dealings with the French kingship.
It's quite bitterly ironic, and it just shows the sort of real politic that's going on in international relations at the time. Because despite the Stuarts historically having a very friendly relationship with France and securing a lot of French support for the Scottish monarchy, they try and maintain these links whilst being massively repressive to Catholics inside their own kingdom. And I was wondering if, to draw a parallel with modern politics, do you think that the impact of the Gunpowder Treason plot can perhaps be compared to the impact of events just prior to the War on Terror?
Oh, 100%. Absolutely, 100%. I mean, the entire thing was used to justify anti-Catholic laws, put down oppressions on people just solely on the basis of their religious belief. And it's an important distinction we have to make. Most English Catholics at the time would not have supported Guy Fawkes and the rest of the members of the Gunpowder Plot, because to most people at the time, historically speaking, they were of their country first. That was what their loyalty was to, not their religion. And yes, Catholics were obviously loyal to the Pope as well as their country, but they didn't really see they didn't really see a problem with that. That was just, you're following two leaders rather than one, but you're following one on spiritual matters, the other on legal matters, and who to fight, basically. The parallels with it all, I mean, yeah, you have the religious extremism of Guy Fawkes and the members of the plot. They were religious extremists, and the closest modern analog to that, it would be jihadists. It would be. They were terrorists. Even though their fears of religious persecution, completely well-founded, given the historical context, they were jihadists. They were religious extremists.
What I found funny in doing some reading for this was it not the government really that sort of marked the remembrance of the 5th of November in the first few years? I think obviously it's turned into sort of a different thing now with Bonfire Night, but I couldn't really ever see someone as ever beginning to mark 9/11 with like anywhere near the sort of hilarity that we mark the 5th of November with, or any other really event. Just there is definitely some parallels with it. And also Guy Fawkes, I was reading, he went off and he fought in Spain, right, against the Netherlands. So if you always get that thing of people going off to go and fight in the Middle East before coming back as like jihads. And sort of I drew that parallel with Guy Fawkes.
It's interesting you say that, but it could be the historian in me to say that it could be perceived as quite an anachronistic way of looking at it. So you might argue that, well, I would argue anyway, that it seems this was the sort of status quo back then. This is the early 1600s. It's this dynamic between Protestantism and Catholicism, which was to dominate the century that was about to occur, with the English Civil War and etc. etc. So I think that this is the beginning of something that sort of creates modern Britain as we see it today. So I think this back and forth was to go on inevitably, rather than seeing it in contemporary morality, in which is just been conveyed previously.
See, on that front, do you not think that perhaps the severity of anti-Catholic laws would have probably been exacerbated by the nature of the plot, and that even if things were to go in the direction they were, if Catholicism was just on its way out in the Isles as a sort of dominant political force in the institutions of government, do you think that perhaps if there wasn't this direct threat against the government in terms of the Gunpowder Plot, that anti-Catholic laws perhaps wouldn't be as strong?
Oh, I disagree. I think they would continue to be quite harsh, because it's against what the sort of ruling the royals actually sort of stood for. They're a symbol of Protestantism. They're the head of the church, as it were. So I think it's not something that's certainly not something that's going to go away, because worshipping the Catholic faith it's not something that is in the sort of status quo of as determined by the royals, really.
I mean, also adding on to that, I don't think that anti-Catholic laws necessarily would have been any looser, because for centuries and even to this day, this, like the Irish identity, for instance, is heavily associated with Catholicism. And at the time, the Irish weren't just demonized for being Catholics; they were also demonized for being Irish. And with the conquests which took place over the next following centuries and had already been taking place of Ireland, it seems very unlikely that English lords and English rulers were going to allow Irish people to practice the faith which they had adopted. So I think anti-Catholic laws, what the Gunpowder Plot provided, it provided, forgive the pun, a spark to to actually kick off a ramping up of anti-Catholic laws in the state. But it didn't provide, in the same way that, say, in the modern analog, 9/11, it didn't provide that impetus to put through repressive legislation at a very, very rapid rate. It was more of a slow, gradual up climb rather than a steep no Catholic.
It sort of
Yeah.
leads into an interesting question about the character of Guy Fawkes in the modern perception today. So, if I might ask, why have we sort of reinterpreted the character of Guy Fawkes as a revolutionary symbol, despite the reality of his being a sort of anarcho-conservative?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I kind of want to say purely because of V for Vendetta.
Yeah,
And
I agree with that.
it is purely kind of because of that whole V for Vendetta thing, because it takes Guy Fawkes, an anarcho-conservative who wanted to restore a Catholic absolute monarchy, and it turns him into this like
Messianic sort of
Yeah.
anti-government figure.
yeah, like this kind of like gross populist underdog, like overthrowing a hypothetical British fascist state. The only similarities between V and Guy Fawkes are probably the mask and the fact they both wanted to blow up Parliament.
It sort
Yeah.
of just comes back to the idea that it's looking back at this time in a sort of modern lens that is quite anachronistic, that we're looking back, we're seeing a sort of dialectic between the ruling elite, Protestant elite, and the conservative Catholic sort of coterie, and we're sort of trying to extract what we want to place in the context of today. So, like with the jihadists as mentioned previously. So it's quite interesting the way that's worked, especially in popular culture, as you've just said.
Yeah. I also think one of the only possible other similarities you could maybe draw between what the modern perception of Guy Fawkes is versus the actual historical reality is the underdog idea, because we root for V in V for Vendetta as the underdog. Everyone loves a good underdog story. It's like, well, you get that little warm, glowy feeling after you watch like a sports movie or something like that. But the reality is Guy Fawkes was an underdog, and he was not a popular underdog. There were very, very few people outside of the plot who would have been like, yeah, maybe a Catholic absolute monarchy is the way to go. I see that's the direction I want my life to take. Whereas in V, it's like, yeah, they're overthrowing a fascist state. It's like, fair enough.
Yeah.
I mean, like you said, John, though, like I think it is to do with context as well. I've never actually seen the V for Vendetta thing, and I never actually knew that the masks that Anonymous wear, for example, was Guy Fawkes. But like because he obviously when they came up with a plot and tried to carry it out, it was very religious society. Well, we were saying that the people didn't have their affiliation to the religion first, but it was still drawn along religious lines. Whereas I think now, apart from obviously a few cases, people were just sort of very separated from religion, and it's not as big of a deal. And obviously the monarchy isn't as influential as it was.
I mean,
So
you say that, Ben, and we are sat in Glasgow, which historically has not had good lines alongside religious lines.
Maybe religion is still important, but I say that just because I can't be arsed. But like, for example, the monarchy especially, like people just aren't as affiliated with the monarchy and as passionate about it, apart from a few old tubbies. But
yeah.
so they then apply the parts of it, the story that they can to their modern lives. And whether he did believe in wanting a Catholic totalitarian state, he still kind of was an anarchist, I think, and that he did want to get rid of at least the current system. So I think
I agree with that. He's an anarchist in the base sense that he wanted to overthrow. He didn't recognize James's reign as
legitimate,
the appropriate sort of ruling class. That it's an interesting way to look at it.
I disagree with the conception he was an anarchist in any meaningful sense of the word. I mean, he wanted essentially the entirety of the same system, just with the leader at the top replaced. Anarchism doesn't believe in, unjust hierarchy, sure. So at a very base level, he's an anarchist. I would say at an actual, if you're going to pinpoint him anywhere, he's a heavy conservative. He's a conservative reformist, maybe.
The trouble with putting modern terms on something that was hundreds of years ago. So it's really interesting the way we're sort of discussing it, isn't it?
I do think it's interesting. Anonymous, of all people, actually adopt this masked figure, because even if you're drawing the popular media like we've been doing, and the modern conception of who Guy Fawkes was as like an anarchist, the idea of a hyper-conservative Catholic who wanted to establish a totalitarian state doesn't really go well with your anarchist hacktivist group that wants to decentralize all authority and give it to all people regardless of who they are.
It's a different context. Yeah, exactly. It's if we're talking about anarchism, we're talking about it in its basest form, that it's literally Fawkes does not agree or recognize the validity of the state in which he lives under. So he wants to just replace it with a very similar, back then a very different idea of Catholic, of a Catholic reign, just like with Queen Mary's reign before James's predecessor. So it's and look at how that ended. Like with Fox's Book of Martyrs, we get a sort of the beginning of this dynamic between Protestantism and Catholicism, and the sort of domination and the sort of methods they use to implement and their power across the British Isles.
Yeah.
And it's quite interesting how actions in the British Isles, where it's very strongly generally Protestants repressing Catholics, how throughout a lot of Central Europe and a lot of Southern Europe, it's exactly the other way around. It is harsh Catholic repression of Protestants. And I think a lot of the narrative does get skewed a bit, and as both sides in the sort of Reformation were being complete and utter bastards to the other faith for the most part. If you're looking at burning of heretics across the continent, it was massive, especially in places like Spain. So,
and with the Spanish Inquisition as well, we see.
I didn't expect that.
It was a surprise.
No, I don't think it was much of a surprise to anyone who wasn't a Catholic in Spain at the time.
I was actually just reading a bit up on the rebellion of the Mariscos. So whilst there's this large sort of a massive conflict over Protestantism and Catholicism going on in mainland Europe, sort of the other elements of religion in Europe are also being squarely stamped on. So Jews and Islamic remnants from the Cordoba Caliphate in Spain are now being expelled. And interestingly enough, Spanish conversion at first, just everyone converted, said, yeah, sure, we're Christian, it's fine. And they weren't. They just kept their indigenous faith, and that's totally fair if you just want to turn a blind eye to it. In Portugal, they turned a blind eye to a lot of intense conversion. But being a radical Catholic regime, the Spanish government just expelled most of the Mariscos, and when they eventually did rise up against this harsh repression in the, I think it's late 1500s, they're crushed. So it's a time of massive religious intolerance throughout all of Europe.
So if we're to take a more political view of the discussion, it sort of begs the question, how has the plot impacted the view of the Constitution in this country if we are to consider the development of Whig historiography?
Well, you see, the problem, first of all, that we're always going to have when we discuss the political history of the British Constitution is it's all based on tradition and precedent. And some law, obviously, but we don't.
That this is itself a tradition, isn't it? That burning effigies, the sort of.
I mean, I agree that it's really weird. It's still kind of considered a little celebration, like a family-friendly celebration, where you're burning an effigy of a bloke who tried to murder the king. I grew up going to those celebrations, and I went to Catholic school. So
it's really distanced from its original.
Oh, 100%. And I feel that's really, I think that's a testament to. I mean, this century, as we've been saying, it was religious turmoil. It was. You never knew whether your neighbor was a papist, or your neighbor was, didn't believe in the Pope, or didn't believe in the Virgin Mary. Oh, God forbid. You didn't know what anyone was actually believing in. That all kind of changes a bit later on with the conception of the modern nation state. Before, it was about loyalty to your monarch. It was about loyalty to your religion. it was loyalty to your family, what's best for me in this society. After it becomes much more of a, how can I best serve my country? This is what I need to do. I need to join the army. I need to become a politician. I need to become a merchant, whatever. I feel that the British Constitution adapted because it was necessary to do so. The political desire at the time in relation to Catholics was, we don't need them. We need good Anglo-Saxon Protestants. We need good Scottish Protestants, good Welsh Protestants, and the Irish, like, we'll work on them. but like, I feel the desire then changes. The more you go along with the development of the nation state, it goes from more of, we don't actually need to repress these people. What we need to do is we need to encase them into some kind of British identity. We need to make them feel like they're part of the nation, because that way they won't rebel. It was done for practical reasons. It was also done because, countries weren't exactly then funding the secret revolutions of religions anymore. Religion wasn't really that much of a motivating factor. It obviously is in the modern world to some people, of course, and that's perfectly valid. But it just, with the British Constitution in general, there was no need for the repression of Catholics anymore. And so there was no real need for those laws to be implemented, or for Protestantism to be placed above any other religion, even though it is still the state religion of England.
Just quickly on like the distortion sort of the image of Guy Fawkes, like it is just sort of a thing. Like we always look back with rose-tinted glasses, even if it's like in the more modern era, like Gandhi or Churchill or something like that. People forget that like what actually they were, or like what happened to them, and things. But and yeah, with regards to the actual constitution, like Brendan said, it's always this sort of hypothetical discussion, because like no one can really, we don't have one, so you can't really say what's in it or whatever. But again, doing some reading for this, I found that James wanted to be called like the King of Great Britain, and obviously like the Act of Union came like a bit later, like a century later. But so I found that interesting, how you could, I don't really know like too much about monarch history and how it sort of developed from there, but how you could sort of trace like modern Great Britain, the country, all the unions, back to sort of his reign.
Yeah, so it seems it was certainly becoming far more secularized in this time, that especially with James's reign, in trying to become Rex Pacificus, as it were, to sort of be the peacemaker and end the Anglo-Spanish War, to sort of unite the peoples of the British Isles underneath the Act of the Union of the Crowns. And it seems far more secular.
The interesting thing is, the minute you get this sort of secular shift away from solely focusing on religion, then we're moving a bit further on historically to sort of the imposition of scientific racism and things like that as a method of disenfranchising and despising various cultures in the British Isles. So especially with Ireland and the Highland clearances. There was I forget the historian's name, but there was a sort of pseudo-historian around the development of scientific racism, who tried to trace the origin of the Picts to a random Germanic tribe that's mentioned in Ptolemy, just to say, oh, they're not Celtic because the Celts are inferior. So you've always got this sort of impetus to divide, and this sort of the divide, and I think it ties in as well just to geography. So the urban-rural divide's made manifest in this. Scotland's central belt becomes this massive industrial powerhouse as time rolls on, and same with a lot of the north of England. And so the elites from these areas start looking down on their rural counterparts in the Highlands. And say, for example, most of Ireland, very rural area outside of Dublin, and there's still the Catholic Protestant division very much manifest there specifically. But there's also this idea of the Irish are just inferior because they're Celtic. So there's various pillars to intolerance throughout the history of Britain. Just quite a grim thing to look into as a whole.
Oh, it's a very grim time period, really. I mean, actually, even saying that, go back 100 years.
Yeah,
it's still about the same. It's just slightly less legal to do it.
Yeah, pretty much.
But yeah, no, I think that's definitely a very interesting point. with the development of the Union of the Crowns with Great Britain, with the idea of an actual national identity rather than, because that was one thing we haven't really mentioned. Yes, you had loyalty to the monarch, you had loyalty to your faith, but the idea of a country as such was still kind of remote from you. If you're just in a town or you're in a village and you've got your family and your extended family all around you living under maybe one or two roofs, but let's face it, probably one, because you're going to be dirt poor. Your loyalty is going to be more to your town or your village than it will be to the far-flung idea of a country. It's going to be more like there were more recusant Catholics in the north than there were in the south. And that makes a lot of sense. If you look at the history of the regions, the north has all of these outside influences. It has far more Norse influence than southern England. And it's just kind of got this, I don't know, I guess people just wanted to express their identities even with this legal persecution. I mean, like I said, I come from a line of English Catholics, and they never bothered to convert to Anglicanism because why would they? They're, like, let's face it, we're arguing about like Anglicanism is Protestantism and Catholicism. They are essentially the same, just with the monarch as pope. And a few less spectacles and rituals in Anglicanism than Catholicism, but they are, for all intents and purposes, a slightly different interpretation of the same book.
Yeah. Wasn't James the monarch that sort of authorized the English translation of the Bible? I'm not too sure about that, but yeah. And then also the other part of the plot was that they were going to start an uprising in the Midlands, which, if you're to go along the theory that the North is more sort of had more Catholics, I find the Midlands a weird starting point, but I think it had to do with the fact that Elizabeth was there or something like that.
Well, she often visited Kenilworth during her reign, because one of her courtiers held the castle there. But yeah, I definitely agree with your point, Brandon, about the sort of localities being the people who live there. It was their universe. That was the extent to which their understanding of life was. That they're going to staunchly support the sort of consensus within these localities, and obviously that's going to contribute even more to the overall picture of this battle of religions. But if we were to, let's go back to the sort of idea of the Gunpowder and Treason plot generally. So how are we to perceive the efforts of the Gunpowder Treason plot? Should we see it as a sort of a terrorist act, or are we seeing it as a righteous resistance against oppression? Because it happened both ways, didn't it? So what do you guys think?
I mean, from a purely political perspective, it was a terrorist attack. There's no two ways about it. Regardless of the religious persecution, it was an attempted terrorist act whose aim was to kill the legal monarch of the country and kill a bunch of members of parliament as well. Granted, I would say you could see it as a freedom fighters act, but you literally can't. The aims of the Gunpowder Plot are simple. It's to kill the king, establish an absolute Catholic monarchy. Yeah. If it was kill the king because he's been oppressing Catholics, then you've got a little bit more nuance. But the religious extremism makes it literally impossible to sit there and go, oh no, they were doing the right thing. It's totally justified.
Yeah, it's just, oh, we're not going to stop the oppression. We're going to repress them right back, the bastards.
Yeah,
we're going to double down on repression. It's weird as well, because you don't really get this idea of universal Christian toleration in England until much later. And even then, it doesn't really catch on. So you had my favourite boys, the Levellers, came up with their agreement of the people. And part of that was going to be universal Protestant toleration. So even the Protestants couldn't bloody get on with each other. So you had the Puritans fighting against the Anglicans and all that.
I'm pretty sure, funny story about the Catholic Church, actually. I do believe that they didn't stop actively trying to convert people until about the 60s. Like,
oh God.
so they had like a weird thing, because the Catholic Church in England and Wales obviously wasn't particularly established due to the whole, Protestant ascendancy.
Yeah, like
The
couple of
whole thing
monasteries
there.
dissolved here or there,
Yeah, so they I think they only came to an agreement with the Church of England to stop actively trying to steal members with each other in like something as late as the 1960s, which is bizarre. But I think the thing to remember about the Gunpowder Plot isn't that it's an act of freedom fighting. It's not about removing oppression from one group in order to make everyone equal. It's about one group trying to take that monopoly of violence and power, and instead of having it concentrate on Catholics, instead have it concentrate on Protestants. Basically, it's about terrorism, and it's about religious persecution and sectarianism. And it's just a very, very strange day to want to celebrate. And I do think that has worrying implications. We are celebrating, essentially, the state successfully preventing a terrorist attack against it, but we are celebrating counter-terrorism there. And that's not necessarily a good thing if we always celebrate counter-terrorism. And, not to sound like I'm justifying terrorism, because I'm not. Terrorism's disgusting. Don't kill innocent people. But what I am saying is there are sometimes legitimate claims to it. I mean, if we've used the example of V for Vendetta because it's obviously explicitly relevant to Guy Fawkes. In that comic series and in that film, V is trying to overthrow a totalitarian fascist state, which is objectively bad. He commits an act of terror. An act of terror is just using violence for a political goal. So I think we need to be really careful when defining terrorism in general, because it's used as a term both in liberal democracies where terrorist attacks take place and harm innocent civilians for no reason. Well, generally from a reason steeped in oppression, but not for a good purpose or a good cause, versus a legitimate overthrow reason, which would be just trying to remove that oppression and trying to make things better for a certain group, or just better overall for everyone. This is not that. The Gunpowder Plot is not a good thing for anyone involved. Catholics, Protestants, Jews, French people, Spanish people, the whole of Europe. Is just not a good thing.
Is it too simple to sort of say what we've said earlier, especially what John said about like applying like modern day values to what happened back then? Because like I think you could say that he was both. I know obviously Brendan said that he wanted to create a Catholic totalitarian state, but he did want to free the persecuted people, but also it was an act of terror.
Yeah, but I also think with that, Ben, you need to keep in mind the fact that he was a convert. He had the choice, and as much as religion is obviously about your personal choice, he made an active decision in his life to convert to Catholicism, fight for Spain, come back, and have all of these extremist Catholic ideals. Like Catholicism's the way forward. I want to impose that on everyone else. There's a difference between that and say, I'm born an English Catholic, so I don't really feel that good about the state oppressing me. Hey, maybe if I kill the king, things might get better for me.
That's an interesting idea that where a person leaves localities, the idea that you mentioned earlier goes across the bigger picture to Spain, fights in Spain against these Catholic, understands the supposedly righteous cause of the Catholic phenomenon, comes back to England and tries to impose it there. So it sort of shows that it's a boxing match, really. It's a jabbing at each other, but yeah, it's just an interesting idea that comes off of the localities there.
One thing I'd like to weigh in on is just this idea of sort of, when we're talking about comparing sort of historical morality with contemporary morality, I'd argue even by the standards of the day, Guy Fawkes and Catesby and all that, we're taking it a little bit far. Because even though there is mass religious and political repression across the continent, the idea of regicide and killing the king and standing in direct opposition to the monarch is something that's a taboo in pretty much every circle until you get major Republican movements coming around. And even then, like, as far as the English Revolution and the English Civil War, killing the king, pretty much no one wanted to kill the king for the longest of times. Everyone wanted him to either abdicate or to just accept a regency council, step down, or agree to token reform. The only reason they managed to kill the king, and why that's such a catastrophic act, is because you had a select few extremists who managed to just barely push their agenda through. So every popular revolt nearly up to this point in medieval Europe and early modern Europe is couching itself in loyalty to the king, and loyalty to the monarch, and loyalty to this fundamental institution because of things like the divine right of kings, this idea that the monarch rules above all. And so rebellions are often couched against particular ministers and government. So when you get the Pilgrimage of Grace in the mid-16th century, you've got this group that is Catholic in nature, that's marching against the Protestant state that's just enforcing itself. And they're not actually fighting against the king, this Protestant king. No, they're couching themselves as loyal to the king and an opponent of Thomas Cromwell, who they view as trying to enforce this Protestant theology. So the population as a whole is generally very pro-monarch up until relatively recently, I'd say. And because of that, most the idea of Guy Fawkes doing a regicide and killing the king is viewed as an especially heinous act, even in the context of the day.
I might put forward a contrasting opinion, if you don't mind. It may be because I'm a sort of medievalist, but it seems there was always consistently throughout history, or at least Western European history, that since the early Middle Ages, there's always been that idea that the hierarchy being God, then it's the king in secular affairs. So when you say that your initial point that Catesby and Fawkes were sort of extremists even in their contemporary time, beyond the contemporary morality that we impose, I would argue to the contrary, because they're doing what many have done before. They're placing God above the secular state. If it's not in line with what they see as God, surely in their minds they have a right to overturn the state.
See,
which makes it the base anarchism, as we spoke earlier, and I really use the term anarchism loosely to
No, it's okay. If we take for the purposes of not having to explain the entire theory of anarchism as a broad umbrella, because I've already done that this week and I don't want to do it again.
Move over to Kropotkin.
For the rest of the podcast.
I would say if we take anarchism to be the removal of what an individual perceives to be an unjust hierarchy, it makes much more sense in our terms and makes sense that way with the political theory as well. Because to Fawkes, it would have been an unjust hierarchy having a Protestant in charge.
Certainly.
Yeah. And I generally would say that even though, they're putting God above the king, and that's viewed as the just thing to do, it's still an extra step further to try and attempt regicide, because God above the king or not, the king is God's regent on earth. And so when you're looking at things like the Pilgrimage of Grace, for example, even though there is this mass repression of Catholics and this attempt to entirely switch the view of the state and completely shift politics and culture in this completely new direction with Protestantism, they still don't try and kill the king. They're still vociferously opposed to the king's ministers, but they don't directly oppose the king. And I definitely will agree with you in that it's around this time that starts to shift, because soon enough you are killing kings all over the place, but it's still this very fine line of very nearly a massive taboo. And I would argue it's not, at the time, it's still viewed as quite a radical act to go as far as to commit regicide.
Sorry, if you really don't mind me putting another contrary position to that, if you don't mind. Not to continue this sort of historical debate, but it seems you're making a sort of presumption that the monarch is God's representative on earth. In the Catholic view, that is not the case.
True. No, you're right. You're absolutely right. It's the Pope. Yeah, sorry.
Then we're sort of, in spiritual affairs, trump secular affairs in the Catholic psyche of this time. This is not extremist at all. It's extremist to sort of submit to it even.
Yeah. And we also need to remember as well that at the time the Pope was actively telling Catholics in England to rebel.
And we had a whole phenomenon across it culturally, politically. We get a lot of art coming out of the Counter-Reformation with Caravaggio and later throughout the century.
There is an important distinction with the regicide, though. Attempted regicide. And the distinction is regicide for religious reasons versus regicide for Republican reasons.
Yeah.
Because you're not killing the king to remove the notion of there being a king. You're removing the king because you don't like that king very much. And we've had regicide for all sorts of reasons. It wasn't exactly a new view. I don't like the king, therefore I'm going to take an army or I'm going to do something to kill the king and get a replacement in. Versus the whole, later revolutions of Europe where it's like, oh no, I just really don't like the idea of the monarchy. I think we'll just kill them all.
Yeah, that's a really good. It's about sort of defining terms, and it seems with that in mind, we're getting a new look at this period. We're getting contrasting worldviews, and people are stubbornly supporting these worldviews absolutely. And obviously, with our unique postmodernist thought after the 50s and 60s, we begin to cynically criticize every single opinion. So without that, people commit too easily, don't they? So we get clashing views of the world.
I don't know. I have an interesting question, which I think could. Do we think that something like the Gunpowder Plot would have eventually happened because we know that anti-Catholic legislation and anti-Catholic laws, regardless of this kind of event, they would have continually been ramped up and up and up. We know that. Like historically, we can make the prediction that would happen. Do we think that something like the Gunpowder Plot or something maybe even worse would have happened to the British state eventually?
What do you mean? Because it did, but it failed. That's what.
Are we talking about the Catholic perspective?
From like a English Catholic perspective.
Yeah.
We know the legislation's getting worse. We know that the living conditions and the legal restrictions on Catholics continue to get worse until the penal laws are abolished.
Yeah.
We know that. So do we think that it just never happened? Like, for whatever reason, they just decide, I don't feel much like blowing up the king anymore. I think we'll leave it for now. Do we think eventually something like it would have happened in this hypothetical?
I'd argue that they'd maybe see an increased support for the Irish Confederates in the English Civil War.
Well,
I think you'd get a lot of English volunteers supporting Catholic Ireland because presumably if anti-Catholic laws are still ramped up to the same extent, you would just get massive amounts of support for the Irish Confederates during the English Civil War because they were the only faction really advocating for Catholic toleration. Even the tolerant Protestant sects like the Levellers, they were still vociferously anti-Catholic. So yes, you'd probably get increased support for the king and a settlement to reduce the radical religious nature of the state and maybe a view towards more secular politics as a whole. Because that's... at a certain point, the Catholics aren't advocating for a Catholic absolute monarchy anymore. They just want to be left alone. Like they've been beaten down, crushed, oppressed needlessly for so many years. And I think at a certain point, they just wanted toleration. They just wanted to be viewed on an equal footing with their fellow man.
Yeah, I think I agree with Robbie. I think it probably something would have happened. But at the same time, like, Britain's, I don't know if it's unique on a world perspective, but it is kind of unique in that we've never had, my historical knowledge isn't the best, but I don't think, compared to, like, for example, France or even a Russia, we've never had, like, a full-on revolution, have we? So
the English Civil War.
English Civil War.
Okay, I don't.
But we had the removal of a monarch and English Commonwealth like, for a while.
When I feel like Britain is a lot less sort of, in that regard, it's just a lot less sort of hot-headed almost. I don't know if then you're just going into debates about the character of the people, but Yeah, I just think people were or have been historically just a bit more.
I don't know. I do think that I think we need to be careful not to witness the political phenomena we just witnessed there of British exceptionalism, where Britain seems to think it's different from every other country on the face of this
No,
planet.
but it's in a bad way. I'd love us to have a revolution, but
I don't think. That's no. Okay, I would say that I get where you're coming from in terms of, but the religious development of Britain, when we can see this from how it interacts even within like the modern geographical boundaries of the British state, we can see how, like, say, the Protestant factions interacted with Catholic factions. We can see it in the modern partition of Ireland. We can see we can see it to an extent even in legal issues which arose in Scotland for centuries after and to this day. You can see things like property rights, income rates, everything like that. All of this is impacted by this sense of religious persecution that took place over centuries. I don't think Britain is very different in the regards of we're different in regards to the form of Protestantism, because like we said earlier, Anglicanism and what was imposed in Scotland with the Church of Scotland and in Ireland and Wales with their churches respectively, it's a different form of Protestantism in the fact that it is basically Catholicism watered down with the monarch as Pope, which is different to, say, Lutheranism.
Yeah.
So we're only different in that regard. The rest of it is the same old religious conflict, which was just ravaging the whole of Europe. There's nothing exceptional there. It's just who should be in charge: the people who worship the man with the funny hat, or the people who don't.
Well, it's which funny hat do you worship?
Oh yeah,
that's
true. Yeah, papal hat or crown.
Listen, purely on hats, I'm a papist. The Pope has a sick hat. The papal tiara is fucking great. It's way better than a crown any day of the week.
I will say that we're coming up to an hour now, so if there's any last insights you guys want to make, do so now.
Yeah. So just one final thing I think to say from a political perspective is when we talk about the Gunpowder Plot and we actually remember what the event was, I think it's really important we don't lose the history of it and what it kind of got morphed into. I mean, I won't say it's offensive because I'm speaking from a Catholic perspective here. It's not an offensive day anymore. It's people let off a bunch of fireworks and get drunk. It's basically like a mini party. I just think we need to be careful about this conception we have of Guy Fawkes as a populist underdog. He was not a populist underdog. He's not someone we should be looking up to for inspiration or ideas. And the rest of them the rest of the plotters aren't exactly golden geese either. So I think we need to try and not lose the history of what the actual event was. We need to kind of reflect back on it critically, and we need to recognize that we shouldn't ever persecute or oppress anyone based on their religion, because it's kind of a dick move.
Well said.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, can't argue with that at all. Remember, kids, don't blow up Parliament.
No terrorism.
Some final insights into this podcast. So firstly, try not to blow up Parliament. Secondly, have a great bonfire night and a happy Guy Fawkes Day.
Sure, happy Guy Fawkes Day.
Yeah.